Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and this is the first video in a series about the rules of Arkham Horror the card game. I know that the rules reference and FAQ are large documents that are difficult to wade through, so I'm going to give you some highlights of things you need to know when playing the game. Now, we all tend to think of the rules as being restrictive, and they make the game a lot harder, and Arkham Horror has a reputation as being a very hard game. But today, I'm going to give you 15 rules that actually come down in the player's favor and make things easier than you might have thought. Now let's be clear, all of these rules are real rules in the rules reference or the FAQ. To prove it to you, I'm going to show you where you can look these things up yourself as we go along. So let's get to it. Number 1 is Doom. Adding Doom to the table does not advance the agenda by itself. That includes the agenda, enemies, and your own cards. The only thing that advances the agenda is the Check Doom Threshold step of the Mythos phase and other cards that specifically tell you to advance the agenda. Let's take a quick look at an example. If you have 3 Doom on the agenda and then start drawing encounter cards during the Mythos phase, if you draw a Cultist, you'll put 1 Doom on the Cultist. If you then draw Mysterious Chanting, you'll put another 2 Doom on a Cultist. Right now we have 6 Doom in play, but we do not advance the agenda. Now if the next player draws Ancient Evils, you'll put down a 7th Doom in play, and now you'll have to advance. This does refocus our strategy a bit. You do want to kill those Cultists with Doom on them ASAP, and cancel Ancient Evils if you can. But also, if you have 5 Doom on the agenda, the next round you are free to stack up as much Doom as you want in play, because the total Doom in play doesn't matter until you actually have a chance to advance the agenda. Let's check our rules provenance here. The agenda advances during the Check Doom Threshold step of the Mythos phase. Unless a card otherwise specifies that it can advance the agenda, this is the only time at which the agenda can advance. Moving on, when you do advance, you must remove all Doom in play. That includes from enemies and Doom on your own cards. Hence why I said it's fine to not worry about Doom in play as long as you know the next round you will advance the agenda. It will all go away. Here is that again in the rules. Okay, number 2, you can trigger abilities on Treacheries at your location, even those in front of other investigators. This is extremely useful. Let's look at Dreams of Relia. It bumps down your willpower, making it harder for you to pass that willpower test to get rid of it. Well, other investigators are unaffected by that skill decrease, so they may have a much easier time of getting rid of it. So, if someone else is at your location, they can spend the action to get rid of this for you. Narcolepsy is almost made for teaching us this rule. Since you cannot trigger abilities, if narcolepsy is in your threat area, you cannot take the action printed on the card. But your fellow investigators can wake you up. It's not just actions either. If you have some spare resources that you want to hand over to help pay for Schizo Tool's hospital debts, you can do that. We'll talk about limits in a bit, but everyone can pitch in during a single round. So, what can't you help out with? Well, the test on Frozen in Fear is not a triggered ability, so only the investigator who is stuck with it can take the test. How about Crypt Chill? No, this is not a triggered ability either. It's a test on a revelation ability. How about Daisy's Necronomicon? It has a triggered ability, and it's in Daisy's threat area. Surely that should count. No, the Necronomicon is not a treachery, it's an asset. The rule has nothing to do with threat areas or anything like that. It's about being a scenario or encounter card at the same location. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Is Hospital Debts an encounter card? It turns out that, yes, weaknesses with an enemy or treachery card type, like Hospital Debts, is an encounter card once it's in play. Let's move on to number 3. Enemy engagement. You probably know that when you draw an enemy from the encounter deck, it is engaged with the investigator who drew it. But enemies with spawn work differently. It bypasses that rule because it simply spawns in the designated location. If there is more than one investigator in that location, then you can choose who it spawns engaged with. So, if you and a friend are both in the location with the most clues and you draw the thrall, you might decide for it to engage your friend instead. Maybe they have a weapon out. Let's check the rules. You get to use the normal rules for enemy engagement unless it is aloof, which is to say, since it doesn't have any prey instructions, you get to choose. Speaking of prey, it's worth talking about prey only. This works almost entirely different from regular prey. Usually enemies with prey only are weaknesses that come from a particular player's deck. That is, its bearer. And usually its bearer will draw it and it will spawn engage with the bearer. Now, the thing that follows is a little unusual because it spawns on the other side of the map. This leads us to the situation where a different investigator can be in the same location as this enemy, and the enemy will not engage anyone. Even more strangely, the thing that follows can be attacked while just sitting there. You don't need to engage it to attack it either. Moonbound Byaki is from one scenario in the Dream Eaters and works the same way. It looks for investigators that have an alarm level of 3 or more. Don't ask, just play that scenario. If no one has such an alarm level, it doesn't even move, and investigators are free to wail on it. Let's look at the rules. This part here talks about engagement, and this part here tells us that we are free to attack unengaged enemies as long as they are not aloof. Number 4, automatic success. Some cards or abilities tell you that a test is automatically successful. This means that the difficulty of the test becomes 0. Even if you know this before drawing tokens, like for toe-to-toe, this is still a skill test, so you are allowed to commit cards. You might want to do this to take advantage of some automatic effects or succeed by effects. If you commit Vicious Blow level 2 to a toe-to-toe test, you will automatically succeed by at least 2, and therefore deal 4 damage in total without risking any failure. Here's the relevant rules section. And this part of the FAQ tells us that this is a normal skill test, except for a few steps that are skipped. Number 5, limits. It took me a while to learn this one because I really had no idea I was missing something. Certainly I was used to seeing the word limit on player cards, like Agnes Baker's deal damage after horror is placed on her is limit once per phase. That seems obvious enough, but I hadn't considered that scenario cards, like locations, could be different. Turns out that limit once per X is for each player. So for our first example, Southside allows an investigator to spend an action to search for an ally asset in their deck and put it into their hand. My investigator can only do this once per game, but a different investigator can come along and do this too. For the Historical Society, the limit is once per round. Each investigator in the game can exhaust an ally to discover a clue every round. And remember Schizo Tool's weakness that we saw earlier? It says limit twice per round. So a team of 3 investigators can move a total of 6 resources over to it in one single round, which is enough to satisfy the weakness entirely. Now, if the game really wants the whole team to be restricted to only once a round, the game will use group limit or sometimes max. Here's the relevant rulings. Alright, number 6, applying damage and horror. If you take damage and horror from the same effect, like say an attack from this ravenous ghoul, you can assign both of it to an ally, like Research Librarian. The Research Librarian isn't defeated from a single horror damage. You get to assign the damage and horror first, and then actually apply it simultaneously. Now the Research Librarian is defeated. This is really helpful to maximize the soak from your assets. To be clear, if the enemy did more than 1 damage and horror, you would still have to assign the extra damage or horror elsewhere. And this won't work if you have multiple enemy attacks that deal only horror or only damage, since you need to resolve each attack one at a time. In that case, the Research Librarian would be defeated after being assigned damage or horror from the first enemy attack, and the damage or horror from the other attack would have to go elsewhere. Here are the rules. Alright, let's move on to number 7, exhausted cards. Exhaust is just a way of tracking the state of cards. Cards can be either exhausted or ready. For player cards, this is usually only relevant when exhaust is part of the cost of initiating an ability. Take a look at boxing gloves. This card gives you +1 combat while fighting as long as the card is in play. Even if you use the reaction ability and exhaust boxing gloves, you still get the +1 combat to any future fight actions. But once you've exhausted the card to search for a spirit card, you cannot exhaust it again to do another search. The difficulty sometimes comes when you have separate abilities that aren't obviously so separate. Ceremonial Sickle has one triggered ability, to fight. When you do so, you can either exhaust the card to place Doom and get some extra damage and skill boosts, or you can not do that, and if you happen to defeat an enemy, you remove 1 Doom from the card. If you've chosen the first ability, you'll exhaust the card. But note that neither the second ability nor the initial fight trigger care about if the card is exhausted. So you are free to use the second ability as much as you want while the card is exhausted. You're only restricted from using the first option as long as you can't pay the cost to exhaust it. Most cards have the cost of initiating the ability to the left of the colon in its text, like on boxing gloves, but Ceremonial Sickle is written a bit differently. Let's look at a few more cards fairly quickly. Ashcan Pete is an investigator who cares about cards that exhaust quite a bit. His personal weakness, Racked by Nightmares, automatically exhausts all assets and doesn't allow them to ready until you or someone else clears the weakness by spending 2 actions. What does this mean for Ashcan Pete? Well, if he had boxing gloves or a ceremonial sickle, you would still be able to use the card's abilities that don't require them to be ready. That is, the +1 while fighting would still be active, and he could still use the second ability on ceremonial sickle. Ashcan Pete's signature card, Duke, however, can't be used at all. Both of Duke's abilities have exhausting the card as a cost. Here's a short bit from the rules about costs. Moving on to number 8, this one is all about attacks of opportunity. You probably know that if you are engaged with an enemy and take any action except fight, evade, parlay, or zine, you will be provoking an attack of opportunity. You might even remember that engaging another enemy also provokes an attack of opportunity. The good news is that there's a lot of things you can do that aren't actually taking actions, and those words are key. If you're not actually taking an action, you can't provoke an attack of opportunity. Safeguard sounds like you're taking an action. It does say move to that location, but you are not actually using one of your actions to do so, so you're safe. Any other reaction abilities or free triggered abilities also fall under this category. Dealing damage isn't a fight ability, so maybe it would provoke an attack, but it doesn't matter because the ability on Beat Cop level 2 is a free triggered ability. The same is true for Cryptographic Cipher, which has 2 abilities, both of which have a bold Investigate designator. Now, the second ability does spend an action, so it would provoke an attack of opportunity. But the first ability does not spend an action, so you are safe from an attack. Take advantage of all the ways to avoid attacks that you can. And here's the rules from the FAQ document. Before we move on, let's hammer this home with the difference between Leo Anderson's ability and Ursula Downs' ability. Leo's ability lets him play an ally after his turn begins. He is not taking an action, so he's free to drop down a guard dog while an enemy is engaged with him. Ursula's ability looks similar. It too is a reaction, but it instructs you to take an action, and investigate actions do provoke attacks of opportunity. Let's check the FAQ here. It's a little more to the point. It is as though you are gaining an action and immediately spending it to perform that action. By the way, you can use any investigate ability for Ursula's ability, including one on an event or an asset in play. That's a bonus helpful rule for you. Number 9, negative skill value. When you compare your skill value to the difficulty of a test, your skill value can't be negative. It's at that point that your skill value is treated as though it were 0. That's incredibly helpful for all the difficulty reduction cards like the ones you see here. If you investigate a 2-shroud location with flashlight, the difficulty of the test will be 0. And if your skill value is 2, you pull a -5 token, your modified skill value will be -3. Since that is a negative skill value, it becomes 0 instead. And since you pass tests where your modified skill value and the test difficulty are equal, you pass the test. I've been careful to keep mentioning after you calculate your modified skill value because there's a strange interaction here with Lucky that I just have to mention. Let's take a look. I'm going to read this right from the rules. For example, Danny tests agility and reveals a -8 chaos token. When applied to his agility of 4, this would reduce his skill value to -4. However, his agility cannot be reduced so that it functions with a value below 0. While the -8 modifier still exists, his agility is still treated as 0. If Danny were to play Lucky to receive a +2 bonus to the test, this bonus would not be applied to the functioning skill value of 0, but rather it is applied in conjunction with all active modifiers. Danny's agility would be calculated as follows: base skill 4, -8 from token, +2 from Lucky, for a total of -2, which is still treated as 0. Okay, enough of that. Another upside to this rule is that you can't fail by more than the test's difficulty. For Rotting Remains or Grasping Hands, the test difficulty is 3. If Roland Banks, who has 3 willpower, draws a -5 token on Rotting Remains, he fails the test by 3, not by 5. Taking 3 horror is still pretty bad, but much better than taking 5 horror. You can also take advantage of this with cards like Look What I Found. If you investigate a 2-shroud location, the most you can ever fail by is 2. So no matter what token you draw, you can always discover at least 1 clue. 1 if you pass, or 2 if you fail and then play this card. Okay, number 10. We're 2/3 of the way through. This one is pretty simple. Don't discard empty assets unless they say to. It's tempting to think that once your 45 automatic runs out of ammo, you should drop it into your discard pile. But it's actually much better that it sticks around. First off, it gives you an opportunity to refill it with cards like extra ammunition. Second, and probably more importantly, empty assets are great fodder for scary cards like Crypt Chill, which make you choose and discard an asset you control. Finally, take note that some assets, like Forbidden Knowledge, explicitly say to discard it if it's run out of uses. Here's the relevant rules that say exactly that. Number 11, changing the game state. Maybe you know that when the game tells you that you must choose between several options, you cannot choose an option that has no effect. Take a look at Fate of All Fools. You have 3 options. If this is the first copy of Fate of All Fools anyone has drawn, options 2 and 3 have no effect. It would be pretty silly for the game to allow you to choose those, and indeed you cannot. The rule is a little more specific though. You must choose an option that changes the game state. It's okay if changing the game state only changes things minimally. Let's take a look at Syzygy next. Again, we have 3 options. Options 2 and 3 will always do something, as awful as they can be, but what about everyone losing 3 resources? In order for the game state to change, all that is required to choose this option is that 1 investigator has at least 1 resource. It's okay if 2 investigators end up losing no resources because they don't have any, or that 1 investigator doesn't lose the full 3 resources. You can still pick it since you still changed the game state. Here's the rules provenance under the section for must. Number 12 is very simple. There's no set turn order during the investigator phase. While you do have to draw encounter cards 1 at a time in player order, there's no such restriction in the investigator phase. This will make things quite a bit easier. Your guardian can go first and deal with that monster your seeker is engaged with. Let's move on to number 13. There are free triggered ability windows all over the place, and it's a good idea to learn where they are so you can maximize your abilities. One tip: there is a free triggered ability window inside of skill tests before and after you commit cards, before you draw a chaos token. Here are 2 reasons why that is helpful. Let's say you draw Crypt Chill, a very scary card that you've seen several times during this video already. If you're pretty sure you're going to fail this test, why not exhaust your Arcane Initiate one last time to search for a spell card? And once you've failed the test, chuck your ally into the discard pile. No hard feelings. And you get rid of the Doom. If you're feeling a bit more optimistic, you could also use this player window to exhaust Ancestral Knowledge to draw a skill card that might actually help you pass the test, and then commit it. This player window is also when you get to spend resources for skill boosts on cards like Physical Training or Streetwise. Here are those relevant steps in the skill test timing framework. Number 14, enemies exhaust. Okay, speaking of timing, even though no one ever remembers this, enemies actually exhaust after attacking in the enemy phase, but they don't disengage from their investigators. This rarely matters, but the last few campaign expansions seem to reference it much more often. Take a look at this Sinister Aspirant from the Scarlet Keys. It has the force ability at the end of the enemy phase. If Sinister Aspirant is ready, place 1 Doom on it. Well, cards don't ready until upkeep, so what are the circumstances where Sinister Aspirant might be ready at the end of the enemy phase? Certainly if you evade this guy, he won't be ready, and now you know that if he attacks you, he won't be ready either. So this ability won't trigger unless he is totally unengaged and wasn't evaded or exhausted. Granted, this is fairly likely in the Scarlet Keys, but it's worth saying that he won't get the Doom if he attacks you this enemy phase. And no one wants extra Doom, so this is a big rule to pay attention to. Going one cycle back to Edge of the Earth, we have this wall of text on Glacial Phantasm. At the end of the enemy phase, if Glacial Phantasm is ready, move it once toward the location of the most investigators, and then everyone at its location or connecting location gets a Tekalili. Alright, if this enemy spawns with you, this ability will almost never happen. Let's think about when it would do anything. Glacial Phantasm would have to be at a location or 2 away from you, and you totally ignore it. Then, at the end of the enemy phase, since it will be ready, it will move towards you, and then you'll get a Tekalili. On the other hand, if it's still alive in the next enemy phase and attacks you, it will be exhausted at the end of the enemy phase, and it won't move or give anyone Tekalili cards. Okay, one silly little interaction. Delilah Aurora can do extra damage to enemies that are exhausted. Normally you should just evade the enemy to exhaust it yourself, but if you happen to take an attack during the enemy phase, the enemy will exhaust itself, and you can use the player window at the end of the enemy phase to exhaust Delilah and deal the enemy 2 damage. Once more, let's check the rulebook. Alright, we've reached the end, number 15. My last rule that will make the game a little bit easier is the rule regarding discarding weaknesses from your hand. You might know that you cannot choose weaknesses when you choose cards to discard from your hand, but you can discard them in other ways. First off, only some weaknesses will sit in your hand, the ones with the player card types, events, skills, assets. These will sit in your hand until you can satisfy their condition for playing them or committing them. First off, you can discard the tower whenever you want, as long as it's in play. That is, once you've paid its cost and play it into your Terra slot, you're allowed to discard it to something like Crypto. For the other cards, there are some other ways to get rid of them. Diabolic Voices is a treachery that makes you discard a number of cards from your hand at random. If one of them happens to be one of those weaknesses on the previous page, so be it. Brown Jenkin is even more helpful. He makes you discard your entire hand. Again, if there are any weaknesses in it, they go into your discard pile too. Liquid Courage is a player card that can make you discard cards at random as well, so no need to wait around for the right treachery. Importantly, all of these effects do not make you choose any cards to discard. As the rules remind us, the rules for weaknesses is that you just can't optionally choose them when deciding which cards to discard. There's another treachery from the Dunwich Legacy that makes you discard all events, skills, or assets from your hand. This is another way you could get rid of those weaknesses with one of those card types. Now, one important caveat, none of this applies to hidden cards, including weaknesses. Those are cards from the Path to Carcosa or the Dream Eaters. Those cards cannot be discarded by any means, except for by the specific instructions on those cards. Okay, That is the end of this Rules Roundup video. I hope you learned something new about the rules and how sometimes, even if it is kind of rare, they can actually work out in your favor. If I made any mistakes or forgot about an important rule that you think makes the game easier, drop a comment down below. And stay tuned for more rules videos in the future, even ones that are not quite as friendly as this one. And of course, check out more Arkham Horror content on my channel in the meantime, and I'll see you in the next one.